Can you imagine being declared dead, only to wake up minutes before your own funeral? This is the story of Maria, a woman who, after a sudden heart attack and a catastrophic failure in medical protocols, was certified as deceased until her own heartbeat refused to stay silent, defying science and sparking a scandal that would bring those responsible for her premature death to their knees. Join us on this journey of mystery, emotion, and the fight for truth. If you love stories that defy the impossible, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our tales. Let's get started. The dawn light timidly filtered through the white linen curtains, painting golden lines on the creamy kitchen walls. The soft murmur of the alarm clock gave way to the distant crowing of roosters, marking the beginning of a new day in the Gonzalez household. Maria sat up silently, her back still numb, and slid her bare feet onto the cold tile floor. Each step was a sigh of routine. The coffee pot began to whistle on the stove, the crusty bread basket rested next to the fruit bowl overflowing with mangoes and oranges, and the ceramic cups, with small hand-painted flowers, waited patiently on the table. In the dining room, the children took their usual places. 7-year-old Sophia played with a lock of hair as she tried to balance her spoon on the bowl of oatmeal with honey. 5-year-old Tomas stared with sparkling eyes into his glass of guava juice, inhaling the sweet aroma before taking his first sip. With her usual elegance, Maria pulled the breakfast cart over, carefully placing each dish. Still steaming toast, scrambled eggs with fresh cheese, a smooth avocado salsa, and plantain slices. The close-ups of those hands were a visual poem. Maria's fingers slender and firm, smoothing the cloth napkin before placing it down. The children's tiny palms catching breadcrumbs without letting them fall to the floor. The loving gesture with which Maria's mother, Dona Carmen, slid the hot cup toward her daughter. A warm silence spread through the room, punctuated only by the clatter of spoons against the porcelain tile and the gentle murmurs of the family sharing a sacred moment. Maria breathed deeply in the combined aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread, and paused for a moment to observe her children. Sophia looked up and gave a shy smile, showing the gap where a tooth had fallen out the night before. Tomas, his mouth still full, let out a sound of approval that made his mother laugh. It was in those moments, when life seemed to flow in perfect time, that Maria confirmed her certainty. Happiness was found in simple gestures and shared glances. The wall clock struck 7 with a sharp click. Maria stood up to pour more coffee and, without realizing it, placed her right hand on her side, just below her ribs. She felt a soft shiver run down her spine. She shook her head as if trying to dispel a slight dizziness, but the wind that came through the window rustled the curtains and seemed to whisper something to her in a barely audible language. At that moment, Maria's mental camera captured every detail. The back of Dona Carmen's hand, wrinkled but warm, gripping her wrist. The girl's reflection in the glass, distorted like a fairground mirror. The imperceptible jingle of the key on the key ring hanging near the door. It was all part of a perfect picture, until suddenly a delicate but insistent pinprick made her squint. As she tried to compose herself so as not to worry the children, a small nudge halted the gentle rhythm of the morning. The certainty that something, still imperceptible, had broken into that moment of calm. And although she tried to ignore it, she knew that in just a few heartbeats, that tiny sensation would completely change the course of her day. The sharp pain in her side grew stronger in the blink of an eye. Maria dropped the coffee cup she was holding in her left hand. The hot liquid spurted onto the tablecloth, forming a puddle that briefly reflected her pain-contorted features. She felt a sudden chill rise from the base of her spine to the back of her neck, and her knees buckled. With a soft groan, she leaned back in the chair. The creaking of the wood mingled with the rapid pounding of her own heart. "Maria!" her husband Daniel exclaimed when he saw her collapse. In a second, he was at her side. He pushed the chair out of the way and held her by the shoulders, trying to break her fall. She tried to answer him, but her voice caught in a dry knot. Daniel's hands searched for the phone and dialed the emergency number with trembling fingers. Each digit echoed in the empty house, the spoons and plates already put away. The echo of the children's footsteps, who, hearing the commotion, appeared behind the door, their eyes wide open. Maria felt the wind suddenly drain from her. Cold sweat flooded her face. Her vision turned greenish at the edges, as if the world were being filtered through an uneven sieve. She tried to look up to reassure her husband, but everything spun and darkness swallowed her. Before she lost consciousness, she heard Sophia's stifled scream and Tomas's mumbled call to her. "Mom!" In less than 2 minutes, the ambulance siren blared on the other side of the gate. Daniel, his voice cracking, explained to the dispatcher in stumbling words what was happening. "My wife chest pains, she fainted, please." Through the window, Maria saw the figure of the paramedic leaning against the door, equipped with a briefcase and defibrillator, moving urgently toward the yard. One step after another, carrying the weight of a life hanging by a thread. Before they could place her on the stretcher, Daniel tried to hold her hand. The cold of his thumb contrasted with the warmth of her palm, and for a moment he saw her tremble, as if an internal switch prompted her to cling to life. Then, carefully and without letting go, the paramedics lifted her up and tightened the straps. The terrified children watched from the doorway. Sophia grabbed Tomas's wrist and, murmuring a childish prayer, covered her mouth with both hands. The ambulance door closed with a loud bang that resonated in the heart of the house. The engine roared, and before it started, the siren issued a final warning wail. Daniel climbed into the seat next to him, held Maria's hand, and leaned his head against the fogged-up glass. Her eyes were closed the entire ride, and every bump in the road felt like a frantic heartbeat that threatened to shut down. The ambulance door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life. Inside, the confined space was illuminated by the flashing lights of the control panels and the red pulse of the siren, which, through the rear window, painted Maria's pale face crimson. Daniel took the seat next to her, fastened his seatbelt, and exhaled with a frown, as if the simple act of breathing required a conscious effort. The on-call paramedic, a young woman with a calm but urgent voice, leaned over Maria while checking her vital signs. "Irregular heart rate, very low blood pressure. We need to stabilize her," she explained quietly, almost in a professional whisper that contrasted with the blaring siren. With quick, precise movements, she inserted an 4 into Maria's forearm and connected a saline drip that dripped with a steady metallic sound. Each drop seemed like a drop of hope against the abyss. Daniel held his wife's hand firmly, trying to convey calm. His fingers brushed Maria's sweaty skin, drawing an instinctive outline of affection. From time to time, his gaze shifted to the children behind the translucent screen. Sophia, tears rolling down her cheeks, clutched the teddy bear to her chest. Tomas, his lips forming a silent O, held his older sister's tiny hand. That scene, frozen between panic and hope, was a microcosm of fragile love held in the air. The ambulance rounded the curve of the main avenue with a squeal of tires, and the flickering light of the siren projected a trembling reflection onto the facades of the houses. Every second counted. The paramedic's mental clock ticked against an invisible marker. The young rescuer prepared the defibrillator, placed the pads on Maria's chest, and whispered to her colleague, "Prepare for shock if she goes into fibrillation," a warning that made even experienced hands tremble. A few gasps of air entered Maria's lungs as the amber bag was connected. The beat of the resuscitation bag marked the rhythm of a human drum, trying to replace the thumping of her incipient heart. The stretcher vibrated slightly as it went over a pothole, and for a fleeting moment, Maria's eyes opened. Daniel, attentive to every sign, squeezed her hand and murmured her name. "Maria, hang in there, my love." She narrowed her eyelids and let out a deep sigh, just as the ambulance pulled away toward the hospital's main entrance. The constant buzzing of fluorescent lights greeted Maria in the emergency room of Central Hospital. The hallway leading to the critical area was lined with railings and parked stretchers, silent witnesses to previous emergencies. Two nurses pushed the stretcher firmly, negotiating the taut gauze still covering Maria's face, while the mechanical ventilator wedged in her mouth panted with rhythmic impulses. Upon reaching the assigned cubicle, the stretcher was wedged between sliding acrylic panels. A deep, imperious voice commanded the attention of the entire team. Team 4, resuscitation in progress. Within seconds, the scene took on the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. The heart monitor, placed next to the stretcher, displayed a straight line, indicating no heartbeat. Dr. Iván Rojas, the head of the shift, peered into the bright light, his tired face furrowed in a frown. With professional calm, he reviewed the electrocardiogram, savored the information on the recording, and ordered, "Prepare for zero shock at 200 joules." Two technicians placed the defibrillator pads on Maria's bare chest, over the conductive gel, and together they stood back as he raised his hand. "Charge! 200 joules!" Crash! A dry pop, followed by a tremor in the gurney, seemed to shake the cubicle. The monitor sprang to life in an attempt to restart cardiac function, but the line remained inert. Without pause, the team performed external cardiac massage, strong, rhythmic compressions, while another nurse administered adrenaline through the fore. Each compression resonated with a wet pop against the chest, each injection bringing a breath of hope. The camera lingered on the close-up of the monitor. The pressure numbers fluctuated, the compression RPM counter went up and down, but the iconic flat line remained. The equipment's knobs and buttons flashed red and yellow, their flashing lights signaling the urgency of the moment. A vital assistance code was announced over the loudspeaker, and two new faces joined the compressions, relieving the exhausted team. Between compressions, the wall clock ticked away with a thunderous sound. Daniel, leaning behind the bulletproof glass, pressed his palms against the screen while his lips whispered incessant prayers. Fear and disbelief were evident on his face. The same heartbeat that had filled the ambulance now echoed in the chest of every onlooker. The paramedics who had transported Maria mingled with the emergency room staff, exchanging information and adjusting IVs. Dr. Rojas frowned at the equipment and, in a firm voice, ordered, "Last attempt, shock at 300 joules." The same choreography was repeated, even more intense, with Maria's body subjected to an electric pulse that seemed to fight against the logic of death itself. The monitor, stubborn, continued to display the flat line, and the heavy silence that followed the second shock was an ominous omen. The frantic coming and going of the doctors came to an abrupt halt when Dr. Iván Rojas removed his gloves and looked at the team with a grave expression. After each futile shock and massage, he had tried every possible maneuver. Now, with his forehead beaded with sweat and his gaze lowered, he uttered the phrase that stopped time in the room: irreversible unemployment. Nurse Vargas, with professional delicacy, took the pristine white sheet hanging from a hook next to the stretcher. With ceremonious movements, she unfolded it and covered Maria's body from head to toe. The silence was so thick that the whirring of the machines seemed to fade completely, leaving only the echo of her own suppressed breathing. The rear-view mirror in the living room reflected, for a moment, Daniel's lifeless face. His glassy eyes stared at the sheet, as if waiting for a miraculous movement that would never come. The young paramedic who had accompanied him from the ambulance followed him, with unsteady steps, and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to convey comfort without words. Through the bulletproof glass, Maria and Dona Carmen's children peered out. Sofia stared, barely aware of what was happening, while Tomas clung to his sister's arm, his voice breaking. "Mom, won't she come back?" The nurse, in a soft voice, closed the door from the inside. "At this point, gentlemen, the procedure is complete." Dr. Rojas left the cubicle and, in front of the emergency room table, paused for a second to arrange his gown. His colleagues gathered the medical equipment, while the flashing lights continued to blink unnoticed. The stretcher, now empty, except for the form covered under the sheet, was pushed back into the hallway, leaving behind a trail of furtive footsteps and pitying glances. Daniel held Dona Carmen's hand as she sobbed silently. No one dared to utter the word dead. The gesture of the spreadsheet was enough to capture in a single act the tragedy that had just occurred. The operating room hallway stretched like a concrete corridor dotted with signs reading silence and restricted area. Under the dim light from the recessed lamps, Daniel, Dona Carmen, and the children waited with bated breath. Each step the surgeons took as they pushed the stretcher toward the exit resonated in their chests like a disturbing drumbeat. When the steel door opened with a soft creak, the medical team emerged, their expressions grave. Dr. Rojas stepped forward, removed his cap, and averted his eyes, avoiding direct contact. The rest of the team remained respectfully silent, gathering instruments and adjusting gowns. The only sounds were the scraping of shoes on the floor and the faint hum of the ventilation system. Daniel took a step forward, his face distraught. What happened?" he murmured, his voice breaking. Dr. Rojas looked up. "We've done everything possible. Your wife suffered a massive cardiac arrest, and, despite resuscitation attempts and life support, she unfortunately didn't respond." A stifled sob broke the silence. Dona Carmen brought her hands to her face and collapsed against her eldest son's chest. Sophia clung to her grandmother's skirt, and Tomas hid his face in his father's arm, clenching a tiny fist. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if to capture one last image of the woman he had loved, and then let out a deep lament. Nurse Vargas, in a gentle voice, handed Daniel Maria's belongings in a sealed bag. Her key ring, her watch, and the red-covered notebook, and closed the zipper with a regretful click. He took the bag with a trembling hand and pressed it to his chest. Around them, the family huddled in a desperate embrace. As they walked away from the operating room, the hallway seemed to lengthen and darken, as if the hospital were suppressing its light under the weight of tragedy. Every face revealed a garden of unshed tears, and the echo of footsteps seemed like an echo of final endings. The light in the small office of the Paz Eterna Funeral Home was dimmer, tinged with a soft yellow that filtered through the translucent curtain next to the counter. A clock on the wall read 10:30 a.m. when Daniel pushed open the glass door and entered with Dona Carmen, Sophia, and Tomas at his side. In front of them, two employees, wearing dark suits and modest ties, waited next to a closed coffin and 3 brown folders. "Good morning," the head attendant greeted in a deep, respectful voice. "I'm Mr. Alvarez, and here is the body of Mrs. Maria Gonzalez, according to hospital orders." Daniel felt a lump in his throat as he approached the coffin. The smooth, varnished lid reflected his own tense expression. Gently, Mr. Alvarez slid a document holder across the mahogany counter. It contained the burial permit, the original death certificate, and the urn selection and floral arrangement forms. "I'll need you to sign here," said the assistant, Miss Ruiz, pointing with a pen. Below is the model of the coffin and the service details. Funeral chapel, transfer to the cemetery, and basic viewing. With a trembling hand, Daniel read the cramped handwriting on each document. His vision blurred at the inexorable phrases: "Burial authorized. Death recorded at 8:45 a.m. The body will be kept in cold storage until service." He signed one after another, aided by Ms. Ruiz's calm voice, as she explained costs and options. Meanwhile, Dona Carmen walked around the coffin, stroking the dark varnish with her fingertips. In the dim reflection, she searched for her daughter's face, trying to see her features even though they were beneath the sealed lid. Sophia watched silently, holding her father's hand, and Tomas played with the white ribbon bow hanging from the handle. "We'll need to prepare the flowers and decorations," Miss Ruiz continued. "Would you like white roses, lilies, or carnations? The basic service includes a floral pedestal and a sympathy pillow." Daniel looked up and, in a low voice, asked for white roses and a bouquet of lilies for the Massachusetts. Dona Carmen nodded, letting out a sigh. Miss Ruiz took notes and slid the folders to the side, indicating the waiting area. You can go to the break room while we coordinate everything. We'll call you in a few minutes to open the wake room. The family retreated with slow steps to the adjacent hallway, where two high-backed chairs offered brief solace. The silence was broken only by the soft ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of other visitors in the funeral home. The echo of their own heartbeats, still painful, seemed to resonate more loudly in the gloom. The hearse moved slowly along the cobblestone avenue, escorted by two family vehicles in a silent procession. The wheels squealed as they stopped in front of the discreet facade of the Paz Eterna funeral home. Under an archway of withered wisteria, for black-clad workers carefully lowered the coffin from the mahogany casket, holding it with white gloves and with the gravity imposed by farewell rites. The evening breeze swayed the fabrics of the mobile chapel. The sharp thud of the wood as it rested on the trestles resonated in the air like a collective sigh. Inside, the hallway leading to the funeral room was decorated with gray carpets and paintings of blurred landscapes. Dim lights were turned on, and floor lamps illuminated a small altar at the head of the altar. A portrait of Mary smiling, surrounded by a worn gold frame. At the foot of the portrait, a velvet cushion embroidered with her name and the legend, "Always in our hearts," was placed, as well as an open book of condolences, its blank pages awaiting the first tremulous signatures. As the curtains that hid the main room were drawn back, the family formed up. Dona Carmen walked first, her head held high despite her stifled tears. Behind her, Daniel held little Sophia's hand, while Tomas took his father's arm. The silence was broken only by the crunch of shoes on the carpet and the soft echo of a teddy bear falling to the floor as Sophia took a few steps back. The coffin lay in the center of the room, flanked by two lecterns with floral arrangements. White roses and lilies, selected minutes before. The flowers gave off a soft aroma that mingled with the incense lit in a small bronze container. Each petal, each leaf seemed to have paused to honor Maria's memory. Dona Carmen approached and touched the smooth wood with her fingertips, as if seeking the warmth previously repelled by the cold sheet. The first mourners began to arrive. Lifelong neighbors, childhood friends, co-workers. With hushed voices and slow steps, they laid their comforting words. "I'm so sorry. She was a great mother. We will always remember her." Each phrase drifted into the emotion-filled air, and their gazes tangled in the portrait, projecting onto its shared stories, distant laughter, and yesterday's secrets. A first micro-hook cut through the solemn atmosphere. A voice in the background, barely a murmur, asked hesitantly, "Are you sure that?" The whisper brought on an abrupt silence. Everyone turned their heads toward the corner where a distant cousin, Mr. Ramirez, was blinking in puzzlement. Seeing the expression on his own trembling lips, he swallowed and cleared his throat, not daring to utter the forbidden word. Dona Carmen, as the family leader, gave him a stern look, but the cousin had already stepped back, unease written on his brow. Their eyes, now filled with a shadow of doubt, scanned the coffin. A growing murmur spread from mouth to mouth. How could he die so suddenly? He didn't even have time to say goodbye. The child and grandmother embraced again, while Daniel, feeling his pulse quicken in his throat, called out to those present in a firm voice, "Please respect this moment." The piano suite playing in the background seemed to pause for a moment, as if it had forgotten the next note. Then it continued, soft and melancholic, weaving chords that resonated in everyone's hearts. The air was filled with memories and unfulfilled promises, while the coffin remained motionless, guarding the body that no longer breathed, until something unexpected, imperceptible, would change everything again. The air in the funeral home had become thick, filled with murmurs and floral scents. Under the soft lamplight, the faces of the mourners were a mosaic of sadness and memory. Dona Carmen stood beside the coffin, handkerchief in hand, whispering broken prayers. Around her, the murmur grew in intensity, as if the words were catching each other. "Are you sure?" "I don't know, but his face has never been so pale. His hands aren't even shaking. What if it was a mistake on the monitor?" A distant cousin leaned toward Maria's sister, his voice barely a whisper. "I swear we talked last night, and she seemed so full of life." Doubts filtered in like a cold breeze, widening small cracks of mistrust. A neighbor, her face furrowed with wrinkles, murmured almost to herself as she signed the condolence book. "I've never seen someone so young leave like that." The echo of that phrase broke the piano's melancholic hymn, and many stopped to look at Maria's portrait. Her eyes shone in the sunlight, oblivious to the room that now held her. A childhood friend, her voice trembling, stroked the frame. What happened in those hours between the hospital and here? Conversations wove in and out, exchanging conjectures. Delay in confirmation? Protocol issues? A misdiagnosis? Each comment added a layer of tension to the coffin, as if the uncertainty weighed more than the lifeless body itself. Sophia, sitting in a nearby armchair, watched with wide, curious eyes. She had picked up a fallen petal from one of the arrangements and was pressed with her fingers, feeling its softness. Tomas, next to his father, remained completely silent, as if the heartbeat of the room had absorbed his words. Daniel, standing, handed a small package to the undertaker. Inside, Maria's notebook with a red cover. In a deep voice, he explained, "I want this to stay next to the coffin." She always found the signs. The attendant nodded and placed the notebook at the foot of the coffin, next to the condolence pillow. There, under the title, "Small Everyday Miracles," the notebook seemed to exude a presence that contradicted the rigidity of the wood and the coldness of the flowers. A faint sigh ran through the group as the young lady picked up the guest book and began to carefully close it. In the background, a younger cousin, a man with a restless look, dared to sigh. "I can't believe he didn't even lift a finger to say goodbye." A tense silence followed his words. Their gazes, filled with uncertainty, returned to the covered body. No one knew if this was mere speculation or a silent warning that something about the wake was off. And as the piano piece resumed its melancholic rhythm, a final micro-hook resonated in the dense air. The faint echo of Maria's face in the portrait seemed to lean forward, as if listening to the whispers that filled the room. The sad murmur of the funeral home seemed to fade for a moment, when Sophia's gaze fell on her mother's portrait. The soft glow of the lamp next to the frame made Maria's eyes sparkle with life. Unconsciously, the girl closed her eyelids, and when she opened them again, her mind projected a memory so vivid that the tension in the room broke for a second. It was an autumn day in Las Palmeras Park. The sun caressed the dry leaves that crunched underfoot, and birdsong mingled with the cheerful clatter of Tomas's bicycle wheels. Maria, dressed in a loose mustard-colored blouse and worn jeans, pushed her son on the metal swing. Their laughter rose into the air, hers clear and sonorous like chimes, Tomas's, a torrent of childlike joy that made her tilt her head back to laugh even louder. In the background, Sophia, with a red scarf tied around her neck, ran after a butterfly dancing among the sunflowers. Each time she caught it, she released it with soft, radiant hands, while Maria watched her with eyes full of pride. Suddenly, Tomas left the swing, jumped off, and ran to his sister's side, and the three embraced in an improvised whirlwind of colored flower. Sophia held a handful of petals she had picked and threw them into the air like confetti. The golden light of the sunset filtered its rays through the treetops, sealing that moment with a magical aura. Maria put her arm around her children and, at that moment, leaned over to whisper something in Sophia's ear. The girl nodded, her eyes full of complicity, and they both burst out laughing. The sound was so contagious that Tomas stopped jumping on the swing to let out a laugh that echoed like a tiny drum. For a few seconds, the entire park seemed immersed in a choreography of joy, where time stretched out and nothing could threaten the bubble of happiness that enveloped the mother and her little ones. Back at the wake, the somber faces softened as they perceived the memory. Some relatives exchanged knowing glances, recalling another of Maria's irrefutable defenses against tragedy. Her hearty laughter, capable of illuminating a forgotten corner. A cousin, her voice trembling, exclaimed, "That's how I always remember her." Full of life. The echo of that phrase drifted through the piano notes, which momentarily changed the tempo to a more hopeful melody. The contrast between the vitality of the memory and the stillness in the room reinforced the strangeness of the situation. How could someone who had shone so brightly now be still under that sheet? The atmosphere in the funeral home had thickened after Sophia's return to the happy memory of the park. The whispers ceased for a moment, while the melancholy notes of the piano filled the space with their faint echo. Dona Carmen, with hesitant steps, approached her daughter's coffin. The mahogany veneer, now slightly warm to the touch, contrasted with the coldness everyone had attributed to the body beneath the sheet. With trembling hands, the grandmother slid the fabric aside, revealing the trail of dark curls around Maria's face. She inhaled deeply, then placed her palm over the back of her daughter's hand. It was an instinctive gesture, almost forbidden, but driven by an unwavering longing. As she placed her fingertips on the skin, she felt a tinge of warmth, faint but unmistakable, that pulled her from the lethargy of pain. "Marisol," whispered Dona Carmen, using her daughter's first name. "Is that you?" Her voice trembled in her throat. The warmth beneath her fingers remained steady, like a silent heartbeat that refused to fade. Dona Carmen withdrew her hand and instead brought her cheek to the cuff of the sheet, sniffing for the familiar scent of the night creams Maria used. A faint trail, a mix of lavender and vanilla, caressed her nose. For a second, her eyes clouded with hope. Her heartbeat seemed to quicken in time with that unexpected warmth. Those present, seeing the gesture, let out a contained murmur that spread like a collective sigh. "Grandma, do you notice anything strange? How can it be lukewarm?" Dona Carmen then removed the sheet completely, revealing Maria's hand, resting on the side of the coffin. With great care, she slid her fingers over the skin again, this time pressing more firmly. The warmth confirmed itself and intensified slightly, as if an inner ember were trying to rekindle. The grandmother looked up, her eyelids fluttering with emotion and doubt. "Oh my God!" she gasped. She's alive." A silence resounded in the room, reminiscent of 1,500 hearts. Daniel, his face distraught, rushed to the coffin and moved his daughter's jaw aside with reverential care, examining her pale forehead and calm lips. "It's not possible," he murmured. "I was told that." Sophia, her eyes like broken moons, leaned closer and pressed her ear to Maria's chest, hoping to hear the eternal beat of the impossible. But she only caught the muffled echo of the piano and her own tiny heartbeat. Then, with a start, she felt a subtle movement beneath her ear, a faint, barely perceptible sigh that vibrated through the wood grain. "Do you hear it?" he asked, almost breathless. Tomas, still clutching the teddy bear, pointed to the side of the coffin. "Mom," she moved. The murmur turned into a subdued clamor. Some guests stepped back in amazement. Others leaned forward, seeking to see with their own eyes what Grandma had discovered. The undertaker, paralyzed, forgot to ask if they would like more floral arrangements. The piano interrupted its melody with a sustained chord, as if music itself were surprised by the discovery. Dona Carmen raised her voice with an energy that seemed to come from another world. "Stop the wake immediately!" The authoritative statement resonated in the room. The workers hurriedly pushed their chairs aside. The florist stepped back, and Daniel stepped forward to kneel beside the coffin, carefully removing the leaf covering his wife. That warm hand, on which his mother had just placed hers, seemed like a bridge between two realities. That of the foretold death and that of the life that refused to abandon her. The intense murmur of astonishment that ran through the funeral home gave way to confusion and urgency. Daniel, still kneeling beside the coffin, noticed the red-covered notebook and documents he'd been given at the funeral home resting on one of the nearby chairs. Hesitantly, he stood and picked up the envelope containing the death certificate. He took a few steps back, leaning his back against the wall, and carefully slid the sheet of paper between his fingers. The tension tightened his neck and forehead. That morning, the document had indicated that Maria's death had been certified at 8:45 a.m. in the emergency room. But now, reading it again carefully, he noticed a different time. 8:30 a.m., 15 minutes before he himself had last seen her heartbeat on the monitor. Daniel frowned and compared the time he remembered. In the ambulance, the blood pressure monitor read 8:48 a.m. when they checked his pulse. On the hospital admission form, the nurse noted 8:46 a.m., just before initiating the resuscitation code. The discrepancy seemed too large to be a simple transcription error. He leaned his forehead against the wall and reviewed every number, every signature at the bottom of the document. With a trembling voice, he turned to Mrs. Carmen and showed her the certificate. "Look at this," he exclaimed. "How can they say he died at 8:30 when the ambulance hadn't even arrived at the hospital yet?" A murmur of disbelief spread among those present. Sophia emerged from her shell of sadness and approached her father. "Dad, do you mean maybe she wasn't dead?" Daniel gathered his strength and nodded. "There may have been an error in the medical records. We need clear answers." The undertaker, very surprised, took a step back and dropped the tip of her pen. "Mr. Gonzalez, this is unusual, but the documents come directly from the hospital records office." Donna Carmen, with her eyes burning, took a deep breath. "Then we'll have to consult those who certified it." As the funeral home once again fell into tense silence, Daniel slipped the certificate into the red notebook and pressed his back against the wall. He knew this discovery couldn't be left there. His wife deserved the truth about her own life. The air, thick with doubt and emotion, made Daniel take a few steps away from the coffin, holding the certificate and the red notebook in both hands. In an urgent voice, he picked up his cell phone and dialed the number of his old friend and colleague, Dr. Alejandro Suarez, an expert in cardiology and intensive care protocols. "Alejandro, it's Daniel. I need your help. It's urgent," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the room, which was still buzzing with whispers. "Do you have a few minutes?" On the other end of the line, Suarez's voice sounded worried. "Sure, Daniel. Tell me, what's going on?" "Something incredible has happened. They certified Maria as dead, indeed, irreversible cardiac arrest, at 8:30 a.m., but the ambulance arrived at the hospital at 8:46. She's currently at the wake, with signs of heat on her hand," Daniel whispered, holding the phone to his ear so as not to disturb the guests further. A brief silence crossed the line, as if Dr. Suarez was mentally reorganizing himself. That's very serious. Do you have the certificate in front of you?" he asked, in a professional tone. "Yes, it says 8:30 a.m. here, and I have 8:46 on my admission card, and the defibrillator was applied at 8:48. There's a discrepancy of at least 15 minutes. Suarez murmured. "It could be a simple typo, or worse, a mistake in the timestamp between different pages of the file. Can you scan the document for me, or read the references for me?" As Daniel held the paper to read the information, the piano music changed to a nervous rhythm, as if accompanying the growing tension. Donna Carmen, along with Sofia and Tomas, remained nearby, but refrained from asking about the call, realizing something very serious was brewing. Here at the top it says, "Death Certificate, Marina Gonzalez Perez, Case History Number 10,523, Time of Death, 8:30 a.m. Date, July 18, 2025. Signed, Dr. Yvonne Rojas, J. of Emergency." And below, Body Discharge Record, 10 a.m., Daniel spoke slowly so as not to make a mistake. I understand, Suarez replied. That's an impossible time. If the head physician signed off at 8:30, but the ECG didn't show a rhythm until after 8:46, then the confirmation came before the monitor closed the code. That contradicts World Health Organization guidelines, which require at least 15 minutes of continuous observation to declare irreversible arrest. The word contradiction echoed in Daniel's mind like an insistent drumbeat. He looked around and saw disbelieving faces. Friends, neighbors, community members beginning to cautiously approach the open coffin. He forced himself to speak quietly. What should we do, Alejandro? First, document everything. Scan the certificate and admission records. Then, formally request a copy of the monitor's reports and the resuscitation report. Based on your description, there was a procedural error that could constitute gross negligence. I can help you interpret the data and, if necessary, issue a preliminary report as an independent expert. Daniel nodded, although Suarez couldn't see him. Thanks, Alejandro. I'll send you everything as soon as I'm done here. Do it quickly, Daniel, and stay calm with the family. This requires rigor, but also delicacy. I know. Thanks. With a lump in his throat, Daniel ended the call and put the phone away. The piano returned to its melancholic tempo, but the sound of the keys now seemed like a metronome marking the countdown to a legal process that had barely begun. He turned toward the courtroom. Maria's hand, still warm, rested on the coffin like an invitation to reopen an entire protocol. Dona Carmen took a step forward, her eyes glassy. Daniel, what did Alejandro say? That all of this could be a serious error in timing and medical procedures. That we need the official reports to know exactly what happened in those 15 phantom minutes. Those present exchanged glances. Some took out their phones to take photos of Maria's hand, the certificate, and the flowers. There was a mixture of relief and determination. The miracle of her return to life was accompanied by questions that couldn't be left unsaid. The commotion contained after the revelation of Maria's lukewarm pulse was interrupted by the buzzing of the funeral home door. Two figures appeared at the threshold. Andrea and Lucia, Maria's older sisters, their gaze fixed on the coffin. Recognizing the scene, they sobbed loudly before moving forward in silence, clinging to each other. Andrea, the twin sister, approached first. Her footsteps echoed years shared. Childhood in the same room, secrets whispered in the shadows, laughter and confidences until dawn. When she reached the coffin, her eyes rested on Maria's hand, still recognizing the faint warmth that had awakened hope. In a broken voice, she murmured, "Sister, I swear you weren't dead." Lucia, the oldest of the three, looked away from the flowers and reached up to take Andrea's hand, checking her pulse with trembling fingers. "Yesterday at 3 in the morning I felt you silent but alive," she said, squeezing the other's hand. "Maybe it wasn't you who called Mom, but your heart." A chorus of sighs ran through the room. Cousins, friends, and neighbors turned to look at the sisters, admiring the certainty on their faces. Dona Carmen, approaching with hesitant steps, placed a kiss on Andrea's forehead and then leaned down to hold Lucia's hand. Emotion rippled through the air like an electric current. Andrea paused for a moment, closed her eyes, and let a memory wash over her. The day before, as she cried alone in Maria's room, believing she would never see her again, she had placed the palm of her hand against the wooden door and felt a faint heartbeat, a pulse that resonated in her fingers. In that instant, she realized something was happening beyond logic. "I don't want to think we were wrong," she finally whispered, opening her eyes. "We need to know if that heartbeat was real." With renewed determination, Andrea stood beside the coffin, where the sheet lay aside. Carefully, she slid her fingertips over the back of Maria's hand. A slight shudder ran through the room, and the collective murmur intensified. Pale faces, trembling hands, eyes reddened with disbelief. Lucia, resting her cheek on the cardboard of the coffin, closed her eyes and exhaled. "It's real. I feel your pulse." Daniel's expression transformed, from confusion to hope, then to determination. He placed the death certificate on the edge of the coffin and, still looking at his mother-in-law and sisters, raised his voice. "This can't be left like this. It's not just us. She's alive." The undertaker, regaining her composure, stepped back as the piano changed register, striking a note of urgency. The air shook with the shared certainty. Maria's sisters reinforced the conviction that her heart had never completely stopped. The silence that followed Dona Carmen's exclamation was soon filled with conflicting voices. The large room, once designed for calm and contemplation, was now transformed into a space of tension and urgent decisions. The undertakers retreated, leaving a narrow aisle between them and the coffin where the family's gaze circulated. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice shaky but firm. "We have to stop everything immediately," he demanded, placing both hands on the edge of the box. "We can't bury someone who's alive." The undertaker's assistant, Assistant Ruiz, raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Mr. Gonzalez, I understand your confusion, but protocol establishes that, once the ceremony has begun, the procedure must be followed to the end." "Protocol?" Andrea retorted, raising her voice. "And what about my sister's dignity? Her right to live? There's so much proof here that she's alive." The warmth of her hand, the heartbeat we felt. "Stop the ceremony!" A murmur of support ran through some of those present, while others clung to tradition. "But what about the flower arrangements? And the clerk who called for prayers? We can't let the church or the community down." Dona Carmen, her voice broken by tears and determination at the same time, addressed the assistant. "You told me that family is respected here. I demand that you close this wake. Take the coffin back to the morgue and notify the hospital." Assistant Ruiz took a deep breath, looking at her watch. The wake had already been going on for more than an hour. With a solemn gesture, she raised her voice. "Very well. We will proceed to suspend the ceremony. I ask that you leave the main hall while we move the coffin." As a couple of workers began moving chairs to open a passageway, Daniel turned to the neighbors. "We appreciate your support and ask that you respect my family's privacy." Her voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't over yet. We can't let a potential medical error go unnoticed." The guests, still in shock, scattered into the hallway and foyer, exchanging astonished glances and urgent explanations. Sophia hugged her father's leg, and Andrea placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go inside, honey. Mom will be back soon." Before the coffin could be completely removed, Lucia stood in front of the group. "I don't want her back in the depot. I demand that she be transferred back to the hospital," he declared. "At least there's trained personnel there to care for her." Daniel nodded and turned to Assistant Ruiz. "Please call an ambulance immediately. My wife needs to return to the hospital." The assistant made an internal call, and within seconds, the murmur of footsteps and the crash of furniture announced the movement of the coffin. Dona Carmen, wiping away her tears, stepped forward to hold her daughter's hand under the sheet. "Calm down, my daughter. We'll see you breathe again." The coffin began to slide toward the main aisle, escorted by the attendants. Behind it, the entire family followed with hesitant steps, like a procession reversing its own mourning. The room fell silent, only broken by the faint echo of the piano, which had now gone out along with the altar candles. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon, tinting the facades of the Paz Eterna funeral home in oranges and purples and casting long shadows on the cobblestones. The coffin, protected by the black canvas of the hearse, gleamed in the fading light, as if wishing to retain one last ray of warmth. Daniel walked alongside Dona Carmen, Andrea, and Lucia, flanked by the workers and Assistant Ruiz, while their children clung to their parents' arms with a mixture of fear and hope. Each footstep resonated against the cobblestones like an echo promising a return, even though uncertainty weighed on their hearts. From the air, the shot captured the procession. 3 black vehicles moving in a row, escorted by a pair of volunteer motorcycle escorts, friends of the family, who sounded their sirens in a sign of urgency. The streets of San Cristobal, normally bustling with street vendors and children playing, had quickly emptied as the procession passed, giving way to a silent convoy. Lanterns were lit one by one, dotting the sky with points of light that reflected off the car windows. In the back seat of the hearse, the coffin rested on fixed trestles, while a collective sigh flowed from within. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. The camera, mounted on a drone, zoomed in to show the entire landscape. The valley of reddish mansions and wooded hills, the storm clouds looming in the distance, and in the background, the silhouette of cypress trees that marked the outline of the cemetery. It was a moment of austere beauty, a farewell before reconciliation with the life that still throbbed beneath the lid. Daniel looked down at the wagon. He could see the glint of the red notebook reflected in the dark varnish, while his own shadow lengthened until it touched the fender. Beside him, the sisters exchanged a gesture, a handshake, a nervous expression that turned into a promise not to give up. As if the sunset itself confirmed the pact. A bolt of lightning split the cloud and cast a beam of light over the road ahead. Thus, the procession advanced toward the cemetery, enveloped in the melancholy of twilight and the determination of a family that refused to let death take away what was still breathing. The cemetery's wrought iron gate slid past the funeral procession, revealing a landscape of stony cypress trees and gravel paths winding between the graves. The sky still held its twilight glow, but the first stars began to twinkle on the blue-gray canvas. The hearse stopped in front of a wide esplanade, where a newly dug grave lay to one side, a rectangle of dark earth framed by wooden planks, a silent witness to other ceremonies. For metal trestles were lined up next to the grave, 2 on each side, ready to receive the coffin. The workers, wearing cotton gloves and discreet reflective vests, carefully lowered the mahogany casket from the vehicle. Each movement was measured, as if they feared disturbing a fragile balance between life and death. The securing straps were loosened, and the coffin was dropped with a soft thud cushioned by the softness of an inner cushion, a dry sound that echoed across the bare earth. Daniel advanced with a determined step toward the end of the coffin. Beside him, Dona Carmen paused for a moment to inhale the fresh air, impregnated with the earthy aroma of the open grave and the flowers that still wove a halo of color around the esplanade. Sophia and Tomas, holding their uncle's hands, gazed at the scene with wide eyes. The symmetry of the trestles, the gap in the earth that seemed to breathe, the smooth tile of the coffin standing out against the uneven background of the sand. The gravedigger, a man with a weathered face and thick hands, approached with the shovel on his shoulder. His deep voice echoed in the silence. "Put the platform in position and let me know when it's secure." 2 workers laid a pair of planks across the grave, creating a temporary walkway. The coffin was centered right on the line between life and death. On one side, the polished wood illuminated by the moving spotlights the staff had placed. On the other, the mouth of the earth, the threshold of the final state. Daniel stepped back a few steps to allow the maneuver, while his mother, her gaze fixed on her, held a bunch of white daisies like a cloak of innocence. A light wind stirred the loose petals and stirred a whisper from the dry leaves. Not everything ends here. Among those present, some bowed their heads in prayer, others crossed their hands over their chests, and a few raised their faces to the sky, seeking a sign. Religion and law dictated the rite, but the family knew that the coffin held more than just a body. It held the mystery of a possible return. The gravedigger placed the palm of his hand against the plank, checking its firmness, and nodded. "Ready." The workers lined up at each end of the box, placing a strap under it. Carefully, they lifted the ends of the coffin, while Daniel stood in front of the grave, guardian of the truth that refused to be buried. Dona Carmen's gaze, alight with hope and fear, fell on the lid. Her fingers tensed, preparing for the moment when the earth would begin to cover it. The silence thickened, on the cusp of the final prelude, as if the world were holding its breath. Then, with a concerted gesture, the workers allowed the coffin to slowly descend onto the trestles. Just before sliding it into the grave, the coffin stopped a foot from the edge, suspended by the committed hands of those holding it. There, in that static moment, the family held its own heartbeat. Facing the open grave, the family lined up in reverence. Daniel stood just behind Dona Carmen, with Sofia on his left and Tomas on his right. Andrea and Lucia closed the circle, shoulder to shoulder, while the gravedigger, with a calm but focused expression, stood on the other side of the gap. His hands, weathered by years of work, rested on the handle of the shovel, as if holding a scepter marking the beginning of the rite. In extreme close-up, each person's features reflected a mixture of fervor and trembling. Their gaze fixed on the coffin, their lips parted in silent prayer, their eyelids moistened. Dona Carmen clasped her hands and lowered her head, silently repeating the litany her mother had taught her as a child. Sofia, with her eyes closed, clenched her fists beneath her father's shawl and murmured the Our Father in a soft voice. Tomas, hugging the teddy bear, imitated the gesture, as if he knew that the moment demanded every word. The gravedigger looked down at the family and nodded gently, respecting the silence that enveloped the esplanade. Then he raised the shovel and placed it vertically in front of the coffin, creating an axis of solemnity that divided the sacred space. For a moment, the mouth of the grave and the polished wood of the coffin were suspended in a moment of contemplation, as if the universe were waiting for the circle to be completed before allowing the next act. The gravedigger leaned the shovel against one of the sawhorses and, with a brief gesture, smoothed his vest and freed his hands from the handle. His face, furrowed by wrinkles from sun and rain, remained impassive, almost ritualistic. Slowly, he unfastened the safety strap holding the coffin to the sawhorses and wound it precisely around one end of the wooden plank. His measured and controlled movements offered a strange comfort. Wherever the ceremony reached a breaking point, the professional maintained his composure. Daniel, along with his sisters and Dona Carmen, watched him with a frown. Their faces showed the tension of knowing that, at any moment, the earth could bury the miracle they had witnessed. Sofia, shoulders squared, squeezed her father's hand. Tomas, holding the teddy bear in his other hand, leaned forward, as if he wanted to get ahead of himself. The air, heavy with the aromas of incense and white daisies, seemed to thicken in the center of the esplanade. A sparrowhawk flew past under the twilight sky, letting out a cry that sounded like an extra heartbeat. The gravedigger turned to the family and nodded gravely. "Everything is ready." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm the lump in his throat, and murmured, "Forward." The gravedigger lifted the shovel and held it upright, planted in the damp earth. His eyes met Dona Carmen's, seeking permission to continue. With a slight nod, she gave the green light for the farewell symbol. Each attendant held their breath. The nervous drumming of a mouse among the dry leaves seemed to be the pulse of Mother Earth herself, reminding them that the rite was not yet over. The gravedigger lowered the shovel a few inches and, with a sweeping motion, raised it again, filled with dark earth. In the fading light of the evening, the grains crowded onto the iron like a terrifying tide of the irreversible. The gravedigger raised the shovel loaded with dark earth to shoulder height. In the foreground, the metal blade appeared filled with a fresh clump of soil, flecks clinging to the edges and reflecting the last golden ray of sunset. Each grain seemed suspended in the air, along with the faint glow of moving particles. The wooden handle, burnished with use, was taut in the gravedigger's firm hands, whose pulse beneath his skin seemed to mark the rhythm of tradition. Behind her, Daniel's face hardened. His eyebrows drew together, his gaze fixed on the shovel. Dona Carmen held her breath, clutching the shawl wrapped around Sofia. The girl looked up, her eyes wide open, unable to tear her gaze away from that swirling earth. Andrea and Lucia exchanged a desperate gesture, a slight nod that seemed to beg for mercy. In the tense silence, the gravedigger placed one foot on the temporary plank, balancing carefully and prepared to throw the earth. The camera focused on his fingertips, which delicately pressed the edge of the shovel, as if modulating the force of his final goodbye. An instant before he dropped the earth, the air became dense, charged with the family's collective energy. The gravedigger bent his knees slightly and, with a controlled motion, dropped the shovel. Damp earth rushed out in a dark torrent, hitting the coffin lid with a dry, solid thud that echoed in the expectant silence. Thud. Each piece of earth, fine gravel, compacted clods, and loose pebbles, piled into a small mound on the varnished wood, marking the beginning of the final farewell. Daniel held his breath, his hands clenching against the edge of the coffin. Dona Carmen paled, pressed her lips together, and closed her eyes as if trying to hold her daughter's breath back. Andrea and Lucia exchanged a look filled with terror and hope, while Sofia and Tomas clung to their father's shawl, feeling each grain of earth hit the lid like a belated heartbeat. Around them, the mourners leaned forward, clinging to the whispered words of prayer and the relentless rhythm of nature demanding its tribute. The distant piano seemed to contour the sound of the shovel, trying to envelop the dull blow in a melody of mourning. Just as the second handful of earth was about to fall, an almost imperceptible creak came from inside the coffin. It was so brief that many attributed it to the echo of the plank straining, but Daniel's eyes were fixed on the lid. The wood had given way a millimeter, as if Maria's inner strength had pushed against the external pressure. A second after the clods of earth rattled on the coffin lid, an internal creaking sounded with a clarity that penetrated the hearts of everyone present. It wasn't the shovel hitting the wood. It was something deeper, like the wood yielding under an internal pressure. The silence became absolute. Even the faint rustle of the leaves stirred by the wind seemed to stop. Daniel, his knuckles gripping the edge of the coffin tightly, felt the lid vibrate beneath his fingers. He stared at the joint in the wood and, in a muffled voice, murmured, "Did you hear it?" Dona Carmen, beside him, took a step back, overcome with disbelief. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she realized that the sound wasn't a structural failure, but the signal of a heart still struggling to beat. Her voice broke into a whisper. "My daughter is moving." Andrea and Lucia rushed forward, pressing their palms against the lid. Their eyes, reddened from crying, reflected the same question. Could it be possible for a body declared lifeless to react to the yoke of death? The varnish chipped slightly under the pressure of their fingers, and a small gasp seemed to emerge from within, like a suppressed gasp. Sofia took an uncertain step and raised her voice with the trembling characteristic of children. "Dad, feel." Daniel leaned forward and placed the pad of his finger on the lid. He felt a disjointed vibration, an irregular pulse that shouldn't be there. His eyes widened as he briefly saw the silhouette of a hand pushing the wood from within. He recoiled in horror and raised his face to the gravedigger, whose eyes also reflected surprise and tension. "Stop everything," the man demanded in a thunderous voice. "No one move." The workers retreated in a rush, leaving the coffin in the middle of the esplanade, an element foreign to the logic of the rite. The wind, like an impassive witness, stirred the ribbons hanging from the trestles as dusk cast its last rays over the scene. A cousin, with a trembling voice, exclaimed, "This can't be happening." The words faded into the cold air. The gravedigger glanced at the group and approached again, shovel in hand, ready to turn over more earth, but Daniel intercepted his advance. "No! First, listen to her." A murmur of agreements and denials intertwined. Some covered their mouths, others turned away to avoid being witnesses. Dona Carmen, with a decidedly firm movement, removed Sophia's scarf and slid it under the lid, seeking direct contact with her skin. The boy, trembling, extended his arm. Silence fell again, and at that exact moment, the internal creaking was repeated, louder and accompanied by a gasp from beneath the wood. It was the voice of someone alive, struggling to break free. The roar ran down the spine of every spectator, and the earth, momentarily forgotten, no longer seemed the ultimate adversary. Daniel stepped back, looked at the gravedigger, and nodded resolutely. He demanded that, before proceeding with any funeral rites, the life beneath be confirmed. Amidst sobs and muffled screams, the group gathered around the coffin again, ready to hear the impossible. The sound of Maria reclaiming her own existence. A muffled echo broke the tense silence, just as everyone present held their breath. It was a dry, rasping cough that vibrated through the varnished wood of the coffin and resonated against the walls of the deserted cemetery. The sound, distinctly human, emerged from a dark, inaccessible point and triggered a collective shudder in the twilight air. Maria, trapped in the darkness, had gathered the strength to expel air from her lungs. A piece of fabric, her floral dress, shifted slightly against the lid as her body pushed decisively. Another cough, longer, echoed among the cypress trees and turned into a wail. The voice of someone returning from the impossible. Daniel took a step forward, staring at the lid. He felt his pulse thundering in his ears and, in unison with the cough, saw the wood give way an inch. A thin line opened like a crack of hope. His heart about to burst, he placed both hands on the coffin and cried out, "Mom, can you hear me?" Daniel's voice, broken by emotion, caught everyone's attention. Donna Carmen, trembling, leaned over the coffin and pressed her ear against the wood. Barely a whisper reached her. "Yeah." The murmur came out in a faint, but unmistakable whisper. A pair of eyes took her handkerchief and placed it on the lid, slat upon slat of cloth to cushion a possible blow. Andrea, breathless, gripped the shovel, as if she wanted to open the lid herself. Lucia clung to her sister's arm, and the children backed away, unable to look away. A dull click announced the first decisive movement. The hinge gave way. A piece of the lid rose a few centimeters, just enough for a fist to emerge with difficulty. The hand, wrapped in the fabric of her dress, pushed hard against the wood, exposing part of a pale elbow. Seconds later, Maria's face appeared. Her half-closed, moist eyes reflected the dim light of the spotlights. Her lips pursed in a final effort, and with an almost stifled gasp, she exhaled. "Don't bury me." The plaintive cry pierced the atmosphere like a dagger. The gravedigger dropped the shovel with a thud. The workers rushed forward in a rush to move the sawhorses, and hurried footsteps broke the order of the ritual. Daniel slid to one side of the lid and, with trembling hands, pulled the wood completely aside, revealing Maria sitting up, her blouse wrinkled and her cheeks streaked with tears. The family crowded around the coffin. Donna Carmen bent down to embrace her daughter's torso, as if she wanted to prevent that miracle from slipping away again. Andrea held Maria's hand, warm and moist, while Lucia wrapped her shawl around her sister's shoulders. Maria's eyelids opened completely, and she saw her husband's distraught face. "Daniel," she whispered in a weak but clear voice. "What happened?" Sophia and Tomas approached cautiously, amazed to see their mother alive, covered in dirt and sweat. The white teddy bear lay on the coffin, a silent witness to the moment death was defeated. A murmur of astonishment and relief rose in unison. The gravedigger, recovering from his stupor, bent down and offered a firm arm. "Ma, I need your support to get out of there safely." Daniel nodded and gently guided Maria upstairs, helping her stand. The glare from the spotlights dimmed a few degrees to offer them privacy, as the family surrounded her in a trembling embrace. Tears flowed uncontrollably, mixing with the beads of sweat and the dust covering the wood. The echo of her words, "Don't bury me," hung in the air, a reminder of the fragility of protocols and the power of life. The empty coffin remained in the grave, surrounded by loose earth and trampled flowers, an offering to a moment no one could forget. The commotion that followed Maria's appearance inside the coffin seemed to dissipate in an instant of relief. But the frantic echo of footsteps and cries of surprise soon turned into adrenaline-fueled chaos. While Daniel and Dona Carmen helped Maria sit up, and Andrea moved the sawhorses away, the gravedigger, still in a state of shock, stepped back a few steps to compose himself. It was then, perhaps instinctively, that one of the workers raised the shovel full of earth he had used for the first blow, ready to remove it from the site, but lost his balance. The shovel swung in the air for a moment that seemed longer than eternity. Then the mound of earth resting on the blade gave way, and a dark torrent descended violently again onto the still ajar lid. Pieces of earth, small pebbles, and dust flew in all directions, spattering Maria's flowered dress and raising an earthy cloud that permeated the clothes of those nearby. "Don't go any further," Daniel shouted in a thunderous voice, stretching out his arms to stop the second avalanche of sand. The scream echoed among the cemetery's cypress trees and clearly reached the ears of the workers, who halted the movement in their tracks. The ground shook with the drops of earth that hit the coffin and the wide esplanade. The dull sound of the grains impacting reverberated throughout the grounds, emphasizing the danger of that mechanical gesture. Maria, covered in dust, and with her hair plastered to her forehead by sweat and dirt, raised her hand to shield her eyes. Her lips, still parted from the effort of emerging, curved in relief at no longer having to bear the pressure on her lifeless body. With a murmur, she moaned, "Enough is enough." Dona Carmen stepped forward, quickly brushing aside her shawl and carefully sweeping away the dust that had settled on her daughter's dress. Her eyes, blazing with alarm, searched for the worker who had dropped the shovel. "Watch out!" she exclaimed, as a hurried step brought her closer to the edge of the pit. Andrea gripped the shovel firmly, leaning it against the makeshift plank that still held part of the coffin up. In a tense voice, she addressed a warning to everyone present. "Hold that shovel, or you'll end up crushing it." The workers looked at each other, confused and embarrassed. One of them, the one who had lost control, dropped the shovel to the ground with a thud. The springy iron bounced on the gravel and remained trembling in the middle of the corridor leading into the cemetery. The earth, still floating in suspension, began to slowly settle on the hair and shoulders of the witnesses, while the flowers in the arrangements were sprinkled with brown dust. In that moment of tense calm, the distant piano piece abandoned its twilight lament for a dissonant chord, as if the music itself were repressing a misguided gesture. Sophia, her eyes wide open, took her mother's hand. "Mom, are you okay?" Maria nodded in a small voice, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Yes, just a little dust." Daniel looked down at the coffin, half covered in earth, and clenched his fists. Around him, family members crowded around to sweep away the dust and pebbles that threatened to return to bury her. Andrea spoke decisively. "Let's move this out of here. My sister needs to get up and breathe without dirt on her." In a coordinated movement, Daniel and the workers moved the box onto solid ground, a step away from the pit. Maria's sisters formed a protective semicircle, and Dona Carmen bent down to help her upright, while Lucia held the white daisies high, like a beacon of light amidst the chaos. The wind stirred the remaining dust and dispersed the clouds of dirt, restoring calm to the esplanade. The gravedigger put the shovel aside, his head bowed and respectful, while the workers carefully picked up the handful of pebbles that had fallen beneath Maria's feet. The scene hung in a mixture of relief and contained tension. The family surrounded Maria, alive and intact despite the assault of the earth, while the coffin, now empty and stained with dust, rested to one side, reminding them how close they had come to losing her again. The empty coffin, stained with dust and dirt, lay at the side of the grave, while the family surrounded Maria, who stood upright between makeshift trestles and still wore remnants of her stony dress. The gravedigger, having recovered from his initial shock, gently held the lid's hinge, ready to facilitate access without causing further damage. Daniel, his face twisted between relief and disbelief, placed a firm hand on his wife's shoulder and nodded to the man with the shovel. "Please, open it all the way," she whispered, her voice brimming with suppressed emotion. The fading light of dusk filtered through the clouds, casting a faint shadow that reflected off the dark wood of the coffin. The gravedigger carefully undid the main hinge and pulled the lid open, which lifted with a barely perceptible metallic squeak. As he did so, the interior was fully revealed. A quilted beige taffeta, slightly wrinkled and flecked with small specks of earth, where Maria lay semi-upright, her hands clutching the edge, her face pale but vibrant. Maria blinked several times, facing the darkness around her. Her lips, cracked with dryness and tension, parted to utter her first word outside the deathly silence. "Daniel," her voice, raspy but clear, rose in the air heavy with incense and withered roses. Daniel, his heart on the verge of bursting, let go of his mother's hand and knelt before her, tenderly taking her right hand. Her fingers, still warm and surprisingly strong, pressed against her husband's with that inner throb that had never ceased. "Love," he whispered through his tears. You're alive." Dona Carmen leaned down next to Sofia and Tomas. The little girl, overcome with immense astonishment, dropped the stuffed animal, approached with hesitant steps, and took her mother's hand, placing a soft kiss on the palm. Little Tomas raised his forehead and, in a self-soothing voice, repeated, "Mother." Between sobs of joy, the grandmother approached the edge of the coffin, which had become a makeshift stretcher, and placed her hand on Maria's forehead, feeling the warmth just beneath her skin. A powdery aroma of incense mingled with the sweat and dampness of the earth, producing an earthy scent that seemed to restore everyone's certainty of the miraculous. Andrea and Lucia, their faces still marked by fear, surrounded their sister and gently lifted her protective shawl. The sisters embraced in a painful yet joyful embrace, holding Maria to their chests as if they feared she might vanish at any moment. The empty easels remained on the esplanade, silent witnesses to an impossible return. The gravedigger, slinging his shovel over his shoulder, stepped back and observed the scene with respect. His hands, accustomed to the final act of life, now contemplated one of the most astonishing resurrections he had ever witnessed. Without a word, he put the shovel away with the fallen flowers and discreetly retreated to the back of the house, allowing the family to share their reunion without further interruption. A slow murmur of thanks, broken prayers, and tears of joy rose from the intimate circle surrounding Mary. The scattered guests, drawn again by the clamor, approached cautiously, reaching out with trembling hands to touch the woman who defied the certainty of death. They all wanted to experience with their own fingers the miracle of that flesh that was beating again. Daniel's mental camera captured every image. His wife's face illuminated by the first stars, her deep breathing that no longer required a respirator, the steady, miraculous pulse that vibrated in the air. In the heart of the cemetery, between the grave and the other graves, that coffin had ceased to contain a dead body and had become the cradle of a new life. The atmosphere exploded in a whirlwind of urgency and shock. No sooner had Maria fully emerged from the coffin than a stifled scream rippled through the cemetery, expanding with the force of an emotional hurricane. Instantly, hospital doctors, alerted by the funeral home through the internal emergency team, burst into the esplanade, followed by gravediggers and workers who dropped their shovels on the ground. Flashing lights from a makeshift ambulance, the same one that had brought her that morning, flickered in the darkness, dyeing the trunks of the cypress trees red and blue. Dr. Ivan Rojas, his lab coat still wrinkled from his haste, rushed to the family's side. His footsteps echoed on the gravel as he dodged overturned chairs and scattered bouquets. In one hand, he held the emergency kit. In the other, a stethoscope whose tube vibrated upon contact with the throbbing bowl of Maria's chest. In a firm voice, he ordered, "Medical assistant, get me the transport stretcher." "Yes, doctor," a nurse replied, pushing her way through the crowd and wheeling a cart with additional resuscitation equipment. At the same time, the gravedigger who had been holding the shovel dropped it with a sigh and ran to assist the team. Slowly moving the coffin lit away against a nearby sawhorse. A second worker lifted the cloth covering Maria and covered her with a clean sheet, while another placed pads on her back to prepare the stretcher. The smell of earth and flowers mingled with that of alcohol and disinfectant, creating an atmosphere that oscillated between the profane and the sacred. The family stepped back to make room. Daniel held his wife's hand, looking at her with eyes filled with gratitude and terror at the same time. Sophia, clinging to her grandmother's skirt, watched the scene with restrained fascination. Tomas, clutching the stuffed animal to his chest, never took his eyes off the doctor's. "Doctor, are you stable?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking. Dr. Rojas gave him a reassuring gesture without stopping working. "She's lost a lot of blood and inhaled dust, but she's resuming spontaneous breathing. We need to take her back to the hospital for immediate observation." Gently, the medics placed Maria on the stretcher, securing her with straps and padding to prevent her from falling. From inside the ambulance, the driver started the engine and turned on the sirens, whose shrillness restored a sense of urgency. The exterior lights reflected glimmering lights on the windows fogged by the evening dew. The grave digger, regaining his composure, picked up the shovel and rested it on his shoulder. His weathered, respectful face brimmed with wonder. Another worker closed the lid of the empty coffin and braced the trestles so they wouldn't obstruct the passage. The distant piano, which had accompanied the funeral, suspended in a long cord, as if the music had stopped to contemplate the miracle. "Fasten your straps," Dr. Rojas ordered. "Come on, we're in a hurry." The paramedics, with trained reflexes, pushed the stretcher toward the rear door of the ambulance. Daniel was invited to get in with his wife. Lucia and Andrea approached to kiss her forehead and place bouquets of daisies in her hand, like amulets of hope. Dr. Rojas brushed a strand of hair away from Maria's face and murmured, "Hang on, Maria. We're almost there." With a dry squeal, the ambulance's rear door closed. The sirens blared again in a frantic clamor, and the vehicle sped off, raising a cloud of dust that dispersed into the cool evening air. The family stood at the threshold of the cemetery, hugging each other and trembling, watching the image of that traveling miracle recede amid the metallic cry of the sirens and the distant echo of interrupted prayers. The ambulance siren cut through the urban air as the vehicle emerged from the cemetery gate, hurtling toward the central hospital. In the back seat, Maria lay on the stretcher, wrapped in a white sheet barely stained with earthy dust, her face gaunt but conscious, with Dr. Rojas at her side and a team of paramedics attentive to her every vital sign. Daniel sat in front of her, holding her left hand tightly, while his other hand pressed the call button to indicate that he did not wish to stop the vehicle at traffic lights or yield to the right-of-way. The interior of the rear cabin was a contained chaos. For canisters hung from a stand, tubes ran toward the needle in Maria's arm, and each monitoring device beeped, indicating blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen saturation. On a lighted panel, the heart rate monitor fluctuated around 80 beats per minute, a miracle after the hours of flatlining that had doomed Maria that morning. "Stay calm, Mr. Gonzalez," the paramedic told Daniel in a professional whisper. "We've stabilized the symptoms, but we need to get to the hospital as soon as possible for a CT scan and further testing." Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off his wife's face. The dim light from the strobe lights reflected in her pupils, giving her eyes a ghostly glow, a mixture of fear and relief. At times, Maria opened her lips to utter a word, but fatigue and dizziness held her back in a broken murmur. "Daniel, "Sure, my love," he replied, squeezing her hand. "We're almost there." The ambulance rounded the curve of the avenue with a squeal of tires on the asphalt. As it passed the central plaza, the cars moved aside en masse, giving way to the emergency scene. The driver, staring out the rear windshield, maneuvered expertly through the traffic, while the siren blared a frantic beat. Inside, Dr. Rojas adjusted the stethoscope on Maria's back, palpating the subscapularis pulse to better assess peripheral circulation. His brow furrowed as he noticed a slight tremor in the arteries, a symptom of the hypothermia the body had been subjected to inside the coffin. He ordered the paramedic, "Give a small dose of dopamine to improve cardiac output and warm the perfusion." "Immediately, doctor," she replied, activating the infusion pump. "I'm monitoring the heart." The dopamine tube pulsed with a steady drip, introducing the active ingredient that would help the blood flow more vigorously. The monitor responded with a gradual increase in systolic and diastolic pressure. The beeps became more rhythmic, almost hopeful. Daniel exhaled a pent-up sigh that turned into a knot of emotion. Through the rear windows, the hospital tower stood out against the night sky, a beacon of urgency and science. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency room access ramp, and the doors swung wide open. Within seconds, a full team of doctors and nurses on duty gathered at the entrance, forming a human chain to extract Maria from the stretcher and carry her to the CT scan room. "Here she is," Dr. Rojas announced, handing Maria to the staff inside. "She needs an immediate chest scan and complete blood work." "Understood," a nurse replied, while another adjusted the stretcher straps. "Quickly, please." The roar of the CT machine activated as soon as the stretcher entered, illuminating the hallway with its white glow. The medical team turned knobs and programmed the post-resuscitation emergency protocol, preparing to extract vital data from the body that had defied death. Daniel and the family, gathered in the adjoining waiting room, exchanged looks of exhaustion and hope. Outside, the ambulance started up again, returning to the morgue, leaving behind a trail of flashing light and the promise that, this time, science could undo its mistake. The sliding door to the recovery room slid behind the stretcher with a soft whir, isolating the din that had accompanied Maria since the cemetery from the bustle of the hallway. There, under the white light and the watchful eye of monitors and infusion sets, the stretcher was wedged next to a small table with 4 bottles, a tray of syringes, and a stethoscope hanging on a metal hook. A soft beep signaled the beating of that heart that refused to give way. Maria, still dressed in her wrinkled blouse and dusty floral dress, rested with her eyelids half open. The whirlwind of emotions was reflected in her expressions. Her forehead beaded with sweat, her turbulent hands gripping the sheet, and the slight tremor of her lips as she tried to utter something. Dr. Rojas, his immaculate gown with a timer ticking away, adjusted the nasal cannula supplying her oxygen, measuring her pulse saturation. Daniel and Dona Carmen entered first, followed by Andrea and Lucia. The children, cradled by a volunteer nurse, peered curiously and fearfully from the doorway. As soon as they saw Maria, Sofia let out a trembling mama and ran to her side, while Tomas clung to his father's skirt. The room, filled with equipment and protocols, was filled with an expectant silence. "How is she?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking, still holding his wife's hand. Dr. Rojas looked up, placed his palm on Maria's shoulder, and shared a gesture of relief and caution. "So far, she's stable. Her cardiac and respiratory function are responding well to treatment. Dopamine, warm saline, and oxygen. But we need to observe her for at least 24 hours to rule out complications such as aspiration pneumonia or post-hypothermic syndrome." Dona Carmen, her eyes filled with tears, nodded vigorously. "Can we keep her?" he murmured. "We won't leave her alone." "Of course," the doctor replied. "You can stay with her the whole time. I just ask that you avoid moving her suddenly and hold the children carefully so as not to disrupt their airways. As she spoke, Andrea took Maria's red notebook out of her bag and flipped through the pages filled with notes. Small everyday miracles. With trembling fingers, she pointed to the last entry. Today is July 18th. Beneath that date, a faint line was visible. Gratitude. Lucia, at her side, closed the notebook and placed it on the table, next to a bouquet of fresh daisies. At that moment, the doors to the room flew open. 2 nurses and an imaging technician entered with a tablet and a set of charts. One of the nurses announced, "Dr. Rojas, the preliminary CT results are ready." Dr. Rojas took the tablet and shook his head slightly as he reviewed the images. There were no signs of hemorrhage or obvious structural damage. The lungs showed mild edema at the right base, consistent with dust aspiration, but not critically severe. He put the tablet away and handed it to one of the nurses. "Keep the perfusion and oxygen. Notify me of any changes in blood pressure or respiratory rate." Daniel sighed deeply and leaned down to kiss Maria's forehead. His voice cracked. "I love you, darling. I won't let anyone do anything without my permission." Donna Carmen, Tomas, and Sofia surrounded Maria, while the sisters exchanged grateful glances. The hum of the machinery served as a backdrop to the collective embrace. The family, united around that makeshift bed, demanded not only explanations, but also justice, medical records, protocols, and responsibilities. Andrea turned to Dr. Rojas. "Doctor, this can't be left like this. We want to see the full report and decide whether to file a formal complaint for negligence and falsification of the certificate." The doctor nodded solemnly. "I understand your position. We'll have to review every part of the file in detail. I'll be in charge of providing you with the reports and assisting you with whatever you need." His voice, firm but compassionate, offered a small measure of relief. The hospital's science would now work alongside the miracle she'd experienced. The monitor beeped louder. Her blood pressure had risen slightly. Dr. Rojas smiled with a hint of triumph. "Look at that! A sign of struggle." Maria, with a barely audible murmur, squeezed her husband's hand. The family, gathered in the white gloom, knew in that instant that they had won an unexpected battle, but that the war for the truth was just beginning. The silence of the recovery room was filled with promises and oaths. To protect her, to care for her, and above all, to ensure that no protocol would ever again threaten the impossible that had just happened. The office door closed behind the family with a soft click that resonated in the tense air. The pale walls, adorned with framed diplomas, seemed more impassive than ever before the surge of emotions flooding the room. Dr. Ivan Rojas, his white coat clean and his tie slightly askew, settled behind his wooden desk and placed his palms flat on the scattered papers. Emergency room reports, ambulance records, and the death certificate. He looked Daniel in the eye, took a deep breath, and began to speak in a tone as professional as it was compassionate. "I fully understand the seriousness of what happened," he said, sliding a report to the center of the table. "It was a very unusual error, and I want to explain to you in detail what happened during those critical minutes." Daniel nodded and rested the back of his hand on the back of his wife's chair. Now sitting next to him, Donna Carmen at his side clutched the red notebook to her chest, recalling each entry of everyday miracles. Sofia and Tomas, silently present, clutched their stuffed animals, oblivious to the medical jargon, but ready to support their mother with the innocence of those who believe the impossible is possible. Dr. Rojas first pointed to the electrocardiogram printed on a sheet of paper. On the graph, lines could be seen rising and falling, unevenly, until, at the point where it had been recorded as irreversible arrest, the trace flattened. With his index finger, he marked that flat line. This, he explained, was where the monitor stopped detecting electrical activity. However, when we reviewed the ambulance records, we found there was a synchronization mismatch between the defibrillator's clock and the hospital's recording system. Andrea frowned. Do you mean that the time doesn't match because the clocks were out of sync? Dr. Rojas nodded, breathing slowly. Exactly. The hospital's ECG machine relied on its own internal time server, which unfortunately hadn't been set correctly after a software update the night before. While the ambulance clock read 8:46, the hospital's timesheet had been set to 8:30. That would explain the discrepancy in the certificate, Daniel murmured gravely. But what about the confirmation itself? If you think she was dead at 8:30, was it just a digital erasure? Dr. Rojas lowered his gaze, clasped his hands in a gesture of contrition, and looked up again honestly. It's not just a digital erasure. There was also a very strict protocol. Upon confirming irreversible arrest, we must observe the patient for an additional 15 minutes, pulseless and with ventilatory support, before declaring death. In your case, the equipment automatically entered code lock mode when the device detected a flat line, and manual protocols were interrupted. Lucia raised her voice, with a lump in her throat. Do you mean they stopped resuscitation before those 15 minutes? Yes, he replied. It was a double failure. The software assumed the flat line was definitive and issued a case close command to the system, disconnecting the ventilator and allowing the monitor to shut down. The staff, relying on the electronic indication, discontinued compressions and adrenaline administration. Donna Carmen let out a sob. My daughter was alone, without hands beating for her, because a clock wasn't set to the right time. Dr. Rojas lowered his voice, saddened. I know, ma'am. I know. It was a serious lapse in procedures and equipment maintenance. I apologize on behalf of the hospital. I'm coordinating a full report on the incident and an audit of all defibrillators and monitors. Furthermore, I promise to personally review the internal protocol so that something like this never happens again. Daniel sat up in his chair, his jaw clenched. I appreciate your honesty, doctor, but it's not enough. This wasn't a simple technical error. It almost cost my wife her life. I'm going to file a lawsuit for negligence and falsification of the certificate. I want the documentation ready and complete by Friday, without fail. Dr. Rojas nodded seriously, aware that this was the inevitable step towards justice. I understand. I've spoken with the hospital's legal department, and I'll make sure they have everything. The time change log, the server logs, the maintenance history, everything. I'm deeply sorry for the pain this has caused you. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the soft beep of the monitor indicating Maria's pulse, a living reminder of the importance of every second and every broken protocol. The contrast between the coldness of medical bureaucracy and the warmth of a resurrected heart fused in the eyes of each family member, determined to transform that mistake into a lesson in life and responsibility. After Dr. Rojas's report in the office, the family exited the hospital hallway, enveloped in a combination of relief, indignation, and resolve. Daniel, clutching the death certificate and hospital records, paused in front of the large windows overlooking the parking lot, gazing at the grayish afternoon sky. Beside him, Andrea and Lucia exchanged a knowing glance. It was time to step forward, to speak out not only for Maria, but for all those who might suffer a similar mistake. Gathered in the spacious emergency room lobby, with the distant murmur of patients being treated as a backdrop, Daniel took a breath and frowned. Facing him were Dr. Rojas, firm, repentant, forced to assume responsibility, the funeral home assistant who had witnessed the interrupted wake, and a select group of witnesses. Donna Carmen, Andrea, Lucia, the children, and 2 trusted doctor friends who had been with the family from the beginning. Daniel raised his voice determinedly. I've heard the technical explanation about the clocks going out of sync and the premature interruption of the resuscitation protocol. His tone, firm and clear, resonated in the hall. But this isn't just an electronic misunderstanding. This is about my wife's life, about the trust we place in those who swore to protect her. Therefore, with deep regret and absolute conviction, I announce that we will file a formal complaint against the Central Hospital and Dr. Iván Rojas for medical negligence and issuing a false death certificate. An emotional silence filled the hallway. Some nurses passing by stopped to listen, and several patients on the benches looked up, sensing the magnitude of what was about to happen. Daniel continued, "First thing tomorrow morning, my lawyer will file the complaint with the court on duty. We'll demand certified copies of every part of the medical record. ECG records, equipment maintenance logs, minutes of the software update meeting, and the full report of the hospital's internal audit." Andrea, with a calm but emotional voice, took the floor. "It's not a question of money. It's a question of justice and preventing this from happening again. We want a thorough investigation and exemplary sanctions so that no other patient is treated this way." Dr. Rojas, with kind words but aware of his responsibility, nodded slowly. "I fully understand your decision and will support it in any way I can. The hospital has already initiated an incident review committee to analyze this failure in protocols. I promise to personally deliver all reports to you and to cooperate with the medical and judicial authorities." A murmur of approval spread among the physician friends present. One of them, Dr. Alejandro Suarez, raised his voice. "I've reviewed the records and confirm there was a serious failure in the clock synchronization software. Furthermore, the premature disconnection from the ventilator violated international resuscitation standards. You can count on my expert testimony in court." Thomas, holding his father's hand, looked up with his large dark eyes and asked in a childish voice, "Dad, are they going to lock her up?" Daniel bent down to look into her eyes and tenderly stroked her cheek. "It's not about punishing anyone unfairly. It's about making them own up to their mistakes and learn so no one else has to go through this, my love." Sophia, next to her mother, held a bouquet of white daisies and added an unexpected strength with her serene silence. Her presence alone, the small fist clenched around the flowers, underlined the family's purpose. Dona Carmen, with a broken but firm voice, concluded, "This complaint is the beginning of a new path. We want to see real changes in the protocols, in the equipment, and in the training of all staff. Here is a family that believes in justice, and Maria deserves more than an apology. She deserves assurances that her miracle will not be in vain." Dr. Rojas picked up a dossier that his secretary handed him and placed it in Daniel's hands. "Here are the preliminary reports I authorized. I'll bring you certified copies first thing tomorrow morning." Daniel opened the file and saw official hospital seals and signatures from the heads of maintenance and IT. With a solemn gesture, he filed it into Maria's red notebook. "Thank you, Doctor. We'll present these documents to the judge tomorrow. Afterward, I want to hold a press conference so the community knows what happened." As he spoke those words, the emergency room corridor seemed to fill with an echo of silent applause. Not of congratulations, but of shared hope. A group of nurses and doctors who were strolling by stopped to watch, recognizing in this family the strength of those who demand the truth. The ambulance that had brought Maria back from the dead was moving away, already stored in storage, and the hospital regained its normal pulse, aware that from that moment on, nothing would be the same in its corridors. The courtroom of First Instance Court No. 4 was packed when the González-Pérez family, escorted by their lawyer, took their seats. The wooden benches rattled with the murmur of journalists and onlookers following the case. In the background, representatives of the Central Hospital, among them Dr. Iván Rojas, accompanied by a lawyer, awaited the judge's instructions. The bench, raised a few steps, showed the magistrate in his immaculate robes and a look of professional serenity, while the clerk opened the proceedings with a sharp rap of the gavel. The preliminary hearing has begun in case 2025-487 for alleged medical negligence and document forgery filed by Mr. Daniel González, representing Ms. María González Pérez, against the Central Hospital and Dr. Iván Rojas. The judge announced in a grave voice, "Are the parties appearing?" "Yes, Your Honor," the family lawyer replied, pointing to Daniel, Andrea, and Lucia, along with Dona Carmen and the children. "We're here to certify the violation of resuscitation protocols and the issuance of a false death certificate." "We're also appearing," the hospital's lawyer agreed. "We're defending Dr. Rojas's good faith and are making the technical records, maintenance reports, and the action protocol available to the court." The magistrate frowned. "We'll proceed first with a statement of the expert proposed by the prosecution. I'll call Dr. Alejandro Suarez." A confident-looking man in a white coat took the stand as an expert witness. He swore to tell the truth and sat before the judge. The family's lawyer began. "Dr. Suarez, can you explain, based on your experience, what resuscitation protocols consist of after a cardiac arrest and the minimum observation time established by international guidelines?" "Of course, Your Honor," he replied. "According to the American Heart Association and the European Resuscitation Council, once the complete absence of pulse and breathing has been confirmed, cardiac massage and assisted ventilation must be performed for at least 15 minutes of continuous observation, with documented recordings of every minute before declaring death irreversible." "And what happened in Mrs. Gonzalez Perez's case?" the lawyer asked. "The ambulance records show a weak pulse until 8:48, but the death certificate indicates 8:30. Furthermore, the ER report shows that the system interrupted care when it detected a flat line before those 15 minutes. The defibrillator was deactivated prematurely due to a software clock skew, and the staff, relying on the electronic signal, stopped the procedures prematurely. Was this technical and procedural error avoidable?" the lawyer continued. "Absolutely. With proper maintenance, regular clock synchronization, and ongoing training, such an error shouldn't have occurred. There are manual double-checking systems to avoid exclusive dependence on software." The judge nodded and addressed the hospital's lawyer. "Now, the defense representatives may question the witness." The hospital lawyer stood up in a measured tone. "Dr. Suarez, do you think there was an intention to cause harm or an error in good faith?" "It was a technical and procedural error, not a deliberate action," the expert responded. "But the negligence is serious because of the consequences." The judge then instructed the clerk to produce the documents: the death certificate, the ambulance records, and the technical reports. They were solemnly handed over to the courtroom table and verified with signatures and seals. The prosecuting attorney requested the intervention of Dr. Rojas himself to explain the discrepancies in person. The judge then invited María González Pérez to take the stand. She stumbled, leaning on Daniel, still visibly fatigued but with a determined look. She swore before the court to tell the truth and sat down in front of the judge. "Mrs. González, please tell us in your own words what happened that morning of July 18th, the judge requested. Maria took a deep breath and, in a firm voice, said, "I woke up with intense chest pain. I lost consciousness and was taken by ambulance. I remember the beeps of the monitor and the cold. In the emergency room, they declared me dead at 8:30, although I was still breathing with assistance. I spent 2 days in a coffin until, as the first shovel of dirt fell, I reacted and coughed, breaking the lid. I heard my mother's and husband's voices, and I knew I didn't want to die. Afterward, they treated me, but I felt abandoned by those who were supposed to be caring for me." The courtroom fell reverently silent. The judge nodded in approval and thanked her for her courage. "Thank you, Ms. González. Your testimony confirms the expert's account." Afterward, the prosecuting attorney requested that Dr. Rojas be summoned to testify. The judge agreed. "Call Dr. Iván Rojas." Dr. Rojas took the stand, accompanied by his lawyer. With a serious expression, he swore to tell the truth and sat down. "Dr. Rojas," the judge began, explained to the court the technical and human reasons that led to the premature interruption of resuscitation and the issuance of the death certificate with the wrong time. Rojas took a breath and said, "I deeply regret what happened. After the software update last night, the defibrillator clock was not set correctly, causing a 16-minute time lag between the hospital monitor and the ambulance defibrillator. When the system detected a flat line, different from the one observed by my colleagues in the ambulance, it issued an automatic code shutdown command. The staff followed the electronic instruction without manually checking for a pulse, and out of respect for technical protocol and trust in the system, the observation time was incomplete. The judge consulted his agenda and, after a brief murmur with the secretary, addressed the parties. I've collected the expert's testimony and the statements from the plaintiff and the defendant. It's agreed to open an investigation to determine responsibility, gather more technical evidence, and prepare a final report. Witnesses will be summoned again, expanding the investigation to include the entire IT department and software maintenance technicians. The Gonzalez family exhaled together. Daniel shook his wife's hand. Andrea and Lucia embraced Donna Carmen. The judge concluded, "With no further items to discuss, the session is adjourned." As they left the courtroom, journalists and members of the public gathered to gather statements. The family, escorted by their lawyer, made a brief statement. "We thank the court for opening the investigation promptly. We trust in justice, and that this process will prevent other lives from being put at risk due to systematic errors." As they walked out into the hallway, the family's spirits seemed lifted and filled with renewed hope. Scientific truth and the voice of a resurrected mother had joined forces to demand changes that no miracle could replace. The air in the Gonzalez-Perez family's living room was warm that afternoon, even as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds. Sitting on the beige linen armchair, Maria watched her children play with wooden blocks on the floor. Each piece painted a different color. Sofia built a small 3-story tower, and Tomas ran around it, pretending he was a train rescuing his mother from a tunnel. Maria smiled tenderly and leaned forward, resting her hands on her knees. She inhaled the warm scent of the vanilla candles Donna Carmen had just lit on the coffee table. Those candles had a dual purpose: to perfume the room and to remind them that each flame was a sigh of gratitude for the miracle that still surrounded them. In a soft voice, he called Sofia. "Come here, my love." The little girl ran and climbed onto her mother's lap. Maria hugged her around the waist, allowing the tower to wobble and the blocks to fall to the floor with a muffled sound. Tomas, holding his teddy bear in one hand and a yellow block in the other, joined in the hug, resting his cheek against his mother's flowery dress. In that instant, Maria's mental chamber recreated the contrast between that scene of safety and the cold walls of the coffin beneath the earth. She felt a brief shiver, which she dissipated with a deep breath. She clung to the laughter of her children, the warmth of the hearth, and the voices of Donna Carmen and Daniel, who, through the half-open door, were planning the legal documents they would file the next day. Daniel walked in with the red notebook under his arm and placed it next to the sofa, on the coffee table. His face showed restrained pride. The notebook had transformed from a record of small, everyday miracles into tangible proof that life and justice could go hand in hand. "Tomorrow's the big day," he murmured, sitting next to Maria. "The lawyer has scheduled us to appear at the courthouse at 9. Maria nodded, her gaze fixed on her husband's dark eyes. With a broken voice, she shared her thoughts. "It wasn't just negligence that almost robbed me, but the indifference of blindly believing in technology without seeing the person. Today we can hug our children because you remember, because you didn't let protocols bury life." Daniel returned the hug, resting his chin on his wife's head. "Today, this house and these hearts are our testimony. Whatever the verdict, this will go down as history. The time death couldn't take us. Donna Carmen poked her head around the door and, with a tray of oatmeal cookies, joined the family circle. "I brought you something to eat," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "After what we've been through, every bite tastes like a miracle." The three of them ate together, amid nervous laughter and knowing glances. The clock struck 8:30. Outside, the twilight turned into a dark blue veil studded with stars. Maria stood up, helped by Daniel, and walked to the small table next to the sofa. She reached out and picked up the red notebook. She opened the blank page she'd left after the summary of that case. July 18th, 2025, second day of life. With a blue ink pen, she wrote slowly. "Today I celebrate the gift of every breath, the beat of every heart that surrounds me, and the justice that will allow me to ensure that no one else suffers because of carelessness." When he finished, he closed the notebook with a soft click. He dropped the pen and turned toward the window. The lights of St. Kitts flickered, united in a collective murmur of hope. "Tomorrow will be important," said Maria. "But the present is a treasure that no one will ever take away from us." The family gathered in a wide embrace, sharing a murmur of promises and eternal love. Outside, the night breeze brought with it the distant chirping of a cricket, reminding them that life, however fragile it may seem, always finds a way to rise from the shadows. Night was slowly advancing over San Cristobal when, on the porch of the red-tiled house, Maria stood gazing at the stars flickering softly in the clear sky. Around her, the familiar silence, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves swaying in the breeze, seemed to cradle her tenderly. At her feet, Sofia and Tomas were asleep in their armchairs, exhausted from a day of intense emotions. Donna Carmen and Daniel had cleared away the plates of cookies, and the red notebook rested on the coffee table, carefully closed after the last entry of gratitude. Maria inhaled the fresh night air deeply, letting the scent of eucalyptus and jasmine blend with the memory of the hospital. The words of her mother and husband echoed in her mind. The promise of justice, the demand for changes in protocols, the commitment to ensure that no other heart was imprisoned by a technological oversight. She felt her own heartbeat vibrate more strongly, like a drum of hope. With a soft step, she returned to the living room and picked up the red notebook. She opened it to the last blank page, page 33, and let the pen touch the paper. In shaky but steady handwriting, she wrote, "Tonight I understand better than ever the incalculable value of every second. I learned that, when the pulse seems to be extinguished, love and vigilance can rekindle life. I am grateful to those who did not give up, to those who felt the pulse beneath the earth, to those who questioned a misplaced clock, to those who cried out for justice. Today I know that the miracle is not just breathing again. It is transforming pain into change, fear into protection. Tomorrow will come judgment, but tonight the verdict is my living heart, my sleeping children, and the promise of a tomorrow where science and humanity walk together." She closed the notebook and placed it on the sofa cushion. Then she headed into the kitchen, where she found Daniel smoking a herbal tea. He looked up and gave her a grateful smile. "You wrote it very well," he murmured, extending the steaming cup. "This notebook will be the testament to our history." Maria nodded, leaned her forehead against the window pane, and in a murmur audible only to her, spoke her voiceover. "Every life deserves to be firmly protected. Every protocol must serve humanity, not the other way around. I have emerged from the earth with the certainty that the truth beats beyond the clocks. May this story serve to ensure that no heart ever beats in silence again." A final sigh escaped her lips. Outside, a nightingale sang its trill, as if confirming in the darkness the victory of the heartbeat over silence. And in that complete serenity, Mary knew that her resurrection had opened the path to justice and a future where every life would be watched over with devotion and rigor. What a thrilling and powerful ending to this story. Every heartbeat of Maria, and every step her family took remind us that the value of a life lies in what we do to protect it. Throughout this journey, we've witnessed how hope can arise even in the darkest moments. Now I ask you, which moment in this story do you think marked the turning point for Maria and her family? Was it the moment Maria reacted in the coffin? Or when the family decided to fight for the truth and justice? Leave your answer in the comments. We're eager to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe so you don't miss more impactful stories, hit like, and leave your response in the comments. Your opinion will keep this story alive.